Welcome to White Paper Podcasts, where our hosts Heather and Andre discuss a wide variety of white papers and scientific studies, making them easy to understand through an informative and entertaining format. Today, Andre and Heather dissect and discuss the main points contained in what is commonly known today as Project 2025. This podcast lasts approximately 24 minutes.
All right, buckle up, because we're diving deep today, folks, into Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise.
A bold title for sure.
It really is, and it's more than just a catchy name, though. Think of this as a sneak peek into a potential 2025, a conservative playbook, if you will, jam-packed with specific reforms for, well, pretty much every corner of the U.S. government.
It's ambitious.
That's an understatement. So if you've ever wondered what a new conservative presidency might actually look like, this deep dive is like getting your hands on the blueprints. Where do we even begin with this?
Well, it's not just about tweaking a policy here or there. This is about a completely different ideological approach.
Complete overhaul.
Right, and what's fascinating is how they're intentionally mirroring Reagan's 1981 mandate for leadership.
Drawing inspiration, or maybe claiming that era as their model for success?
I think it's safe to say they see it as a model. They're picking up the torch, so to speak. It's not just about saying, government is the problem, which we've heard before. This is different.
How so?
This is about systematically dismantling what they call the administrative state.
Dismantling the administrative state? We're going to hear that phrase a lot, aren't we?
Absolutely. It's key to understanding their thinking. They see career government employees, the bureaucracy itself, as actively working against a conservative agenda.
Almost as if they're expecting a fight from within.
It's like they're bracing for impact from day one.
So let's paint a picture for our listeners.
Okay.
We're talking about bureaucrats intentionally undermining the president, maybe even going so far as to claim officials are deliberately aiding illegal immigration. Is this a real concern, or is it more about creating a convenient enemy?
It's definitely a powerful narrative, no doubt. But we should point out that this suspicion of the bureaucracy isn't new for conservatives. What's really striking here is how they plan to address it.
It's not enough to win the election, is it?
Not even close. They're talking about controlling every level of government, right down to putting loyalists in HR departments.
Wow, so it's about more than just who's in the Oval Office. It's about controlling the entire machinery of government.
Precisely. They even call out the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, as this crucial tool for reshaping the federal workforce. Think about it.
The OPM, that's like the HR department for the whole federal government, right?
Exactly. And they're basically saying it should report directly to the president.
Wow. It's like they're saying, forget training the swamp. We're going to fill it with our own people. And it's not just about who they hire. This book is really concerned with power, like who controls information, how to stop leaks.
Yes, like with the Office of Legislative Affairs. They want that office to be the only voice Congress hears from the White House.
Total message control.
Exactly.
And then there's the Office of Public Liaison. It's like they want to use it as a loyalty test for interest groups who are either with us or against us. It's fascinating and a little unnerving how much they focus on centralizing power. This isn't really about smaller government, is it?
Not at all. It's about laser focusing it to achieve specific goals, even if it means bulldozing the existing structures.
And those goals become even more clear when we start looking at their plans for individual government departments. Each one gets a needed reforms section, but some are definitely more radical than others.
Right, like the Department of Education is basically marked for demolition. They want to scatter its programs to the wind and go all in on school choice.
Hitting the undo button on decades of education policy. And since we're on the topic of hot-button issues, the Department of Energy is in for a complete 180, with a massive emphasis on what they call traditional energy.
We're talking boosting oil, gas, and coal, and really slamming the brakes on any climate initiatives. They even seem skeptical of renewable energy.
It's like they want to go back to a time when energy policy was simpler, less focused on climate change.
And it's not just about the source of the energy. They're concerned about what they see as a politicized bureaucracy within the energy department. They want to replace leadership at all levels, essentially hitting the reset button. They want to refocus the entire department on what they consider its core mission, making sure America has reliable and affordable energy.
It's a pretty clear rejection of where things were headed now, and it looks like the hits keep coming, this time for the Department of Justice. What's their vision for law and order in America?
They want to see the Justice Department get a lot more aggressive. Immigration enforcement is a huge priority for them. They even want to dust off an old law, the REO Act, usually reserved for organized crime, and use it to target cartels at the border.
The RCO Act, that's pretty serious legal firepower. What's the thinking there?
Their argument is that the cartels are a different breed, a national security threat that needs a much stronger response. It's about sending a message.
And it's not just about who they're prosecuting. They're talking about rooting out what they see as liberal bias within the Justice Department itself.
Exactly. They want to replace leadership, re-examine current cases, really shift the department's priorities to fit a more conservative definition of law and order.
They are not shying away from controversy, that's for sure. And speaking of controversial, one of the most striking sections of this whole book is how they envision the American family. This isn't just about tax breaks. They're talking about the government actively stepping into, and I'm quoting here, rescue America's kids from familial breakdown.
That's a strong statement for sure. It goes beyond the typical talking points. They want to use things like the tax code to incentivize a very particular family structure. They even call out the Respect for Marriage Act as an example of things going in the wrong direction.
Wow, they really went there. It's a very clear statement about the role they believe the government should play in shaping social values. It's almost as if they're saying the government has a moral obligation to promote a particular type of family.
And they tie this into a whole range of social issues. We're talking about what they see as attacks on traditional gender roles, the decline of religious values in society. It's all connected in their view.
It's like they're providing a very specific answer to the question, what is the role of family in the 21st century? And let's be clear, it's a conservative one. But it's not just about what's happening here at home. They've got some strong opinions on America's place in the world. And this is where their stance on intelligence and foreign policy gets really interesting.
Absolutely. A big chunk of this book is dedicated to rethinking the intelligence community and how America projects power on a global scale. And one thing is crystal clear. They are deeply suspicious of how these institutions have been operating, especially when it comes to sharing intelligence.
They even go as far as to accuse the intelligence community of being politicized, suggesting that intelligence is being leaked selectively to fit certain narratives. That's a bold accusation.
It is, and their solution is more control, more oversight. They want to rein in what they see as an intelligence apparatus that's gotten out of control.
And while they're calling for more scrutiny in some areas, they're also very clear about who they see as the biggest threat on the global stage, China.
China is public enemy number one in their view.
The big bad wolf.
It's the issue that defines their entire foreign policy outlook, and they're calling for nothing short of an economic and security offensive to counter China's rise.
So no more playing nice?
Not even a little. Their argument is that past administrations, both Democrat and Republican, have been too soft on China, allowing them to gain a strategic advantage.
And they're ready to reverse course, it seems. They even propose creating something like, get this, a new NATO, but this time specifically designed to contain China. That's a pretty dramatic shift in how we usually think about alliances. It shows you just how seriously they're taking this rivalry.
Absolutely. And that America First approach, as they call it, extends to how they view those big international organizations like the UN. They argue that these groups often work against American interests.
And they're not afraid to say it.
Not at all. They're ready to pull back funding or even withdraw completely if they have to.
So less global cooperation, more about projecting American strength on the world stage. But it's not just about military might, is it? They're also looking at how to leverage economic power, especially when it comes to trade.
Absolutely. And remember that word they love, dismantling. Well, they've got the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in their sights.
No kidding.
They argue that the WTO is actually hurting American interests.
So they see global trade as this rigged game where America's been getting the short end of the stick.
That's their view. They even suggest that tariffs might be necessary.
They're not afraid to use those, even though the book seems to show some disagreement within conservative circles on that particular tactic.
That's an important point. They generally favor a more assertive approach to trade, but there are definitely some differing opinions about how to actually do it. Some love the idea of tariffs, while others see them as counterproductive, hurting American businesses and consumers in the long run.
It's one of those rare moments where their unified front seems to crack a little. But let's get back to those department overhauls. Homeland security is another big one, especially when it comes to immigration. They've got some pretty eye-catching proposals there.
Immigration is huge for them. Remember how they want to give more power to those political appointees?
Oh yeah, stacking the deck.
Well, they want to remove some of the restrictions on immigration officials, give them more flexibility to act quickly. One of their proposals that really stands out is this idea of using what they call Blackie's warrants for worksite enforcement.
Blackie's warrants. You're going to have to explain this one. Sounds like something out of an old Western, not a policy document.
Think of it this way. It's a legal tactic that makes it easier to raid businesses suspected of hiring undocumented workers.
Ah, I see.
The name comes from an old Supreme Court case from the 70s, but the idea is to send a strong message. If you're hiring undocumented workers, you're going to face some serious consequences.
So you're talking about a much more aggressive, some might even say heavy-handed approach to enforcement. What about those other agencies, the ones dealing with things like healthcare and housing? Are they on the chopping block too?
They're definitely in for a major shakeup. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, is a huge target, especially Medicare and Medicaid.
Those are big ones.
Massive. And their argument is that these programs are unsustainable, both financially and because they stifle innovation.
So less government involvement in healthcare. That's a pretty big deal, especially considering how much of the economy is tied to healthcare.
It's a huge shift for sure. They want to move towards a more market-driven system with less regulation, more choice for consumers, and a bigger emphasis on private sector solutions. They even bring up ideas like direct primary care, where you pay your doctor a flat fee for basic services, essentially bypassing insurance companies altogether.
Wow, that's a pretty radical departure from where things are headed now.
It is.
And it seems like that same philosophy, individual responsibility, limited government, it guides their approach to housing policy too.
Absolutely. They want to refocus HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, on promoting homeownership.
Instead of those government-subsidized housing programs.
Right. They argue that homeownership is the key to building wealth, and they believe government policy should be geared toward helping people buy homes, not replacing private ownership.
So fewer large-scale public housing projects, and more about helping people get into their own homes. It's about empowerment, at least that's how they see it. Less reliance on government handouts, more about individual initiative.
And it all circles back to their belief in limited government. They are highly critical of what they call HUD's bloated bureaucracy, claiming it actually stifles innovation and drives up housing costs. They even want to revisit those policies that allow the government to seize private property for development, arguing that too often these projects displace residents unnecessarily.
It's really interesting how they link these different issues, things that seem somewhat separate on the surface, back to these core principles. But let's shift gears here for a minute and talk about another hot button issue, the environment. You know, the EPA is always caught in the crossfire when it comes to conservative reforms. What's their take on environmental policy?
They're not fans of what they call the EPA's regulatory overreach. They want to streamline the agency, cut out anything they see as duplicative, and refocus its mission on what they consider its essential functions.
Which are?
Protecting public health and safety. That's it.
Not so much tackling global climate change.
They see that as an ideologically driven agenda that goes beyond the EPA's original purpose. They're much more interested in practical, local environmental protection.
So less about saving the planet, more about making sure your local river isn't on fire.
You could say that. It's about shrinking the regulatory footprint, which fits with their broader philosophy. And they're not just talking about shifting priorities within the agency. They want to take another look at some of those bedrock environmental laws.
The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, those.
Those are definitely on the table. They're willing to repeal or significantly reform anything they deem outdated or ineffective. It's a pretty bold stance, even for conservatives.
It really is. It's about shrinking the regulatory state, which, as you said, is the central theme here. What about transportation? Anything major in store for the FAA?
They have some pretty radical ideas about how the FAA should be funded and structured. Their goal is to make it operate more like a business, with less reliance on those yearly appropriations from Congress.
So a more independent, less political FAA, how do they see that working in practice?
They throw out a few different options. Separating the FAA from the Department of Transportation completely is one idea. Overhauling its funding system is another, maybe through user fees or some other mechanism that makes it less reliant on those congressional appropriations.
That would be a major shakeup. And speaking of agencies that could use a shakeup, what about the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA? It's no secret that the VA has been struggling for years.
They acknowledge the challenges, the aging infrastructure, the difficulties in recruiting qualified staff. It's a long list. And their proposed solution is a complete overhaul of how the VA operates.
So not just throwing more money at the problem, but actually changing how the system works from the ground up.
Exactly. Their argument is that the VA needs to become more flexible, more responsive, with less bureaucracy, and a laser focus on providing high-quality care. They even suggest allowing veterans to use their VA benefits at private healthcare providers.
Giving them more choice, more flexibility.
Right. It's about putting veterans in the driver's seat when it comes to their healthcare.
It's a bold vision, that's for sure. And again, it all comes back to their belief in empowering individuals and reducing reliance on big government.
It's a constant theme throughout this book. Whether it's education, energy, or healthcare, their goal is to shift away from what they see as a bloated, inefficient federal government and towards a system that emphasizes personal responsibility, free markets, and minimal government intervention.
It's an approach that's sure to be controversial, but it's important to understand their reasoning, the principles driving these proposals.
I agree. Whether you agree with them or not, they've laid out a very clear vision of what they see as a more effective, more accountable, more conservative approach to governing in the 21st century. And understanding that vision is critical for anyone who wants to participate in this ongoing debate about the role of government in American society.
Speaking of the role of government, we haven't even touched on how they view those powerful independent agencies, the ones that operate outside the traditional departmental structure. We're talking about those alphabet soup entities like the FCC, the FEC, the FTC. Do these agencies escape scrutiny in this conservative playbook?
Not a chance. They see these independent agencies as ripe for reform. Too powerful, too unaccountable, that's their view. Out of touch with the people they're supposed to be serving.
So even those agencies that are supposed to be somewhat independent from the president, they're fair game.
Totally. And this gets to the heart of how they view presidential power. They believe a president should have more control, not less, even over entities that are designed to be somewhat shielded from political influence.
It's like they're saying the best way to ensure accountability is to give more power to the person at the very top.
You got it. And they're not just talking in vague terms here. They lay out specific reforms. Let's take the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, for example.
The FCC, they oversee everything from radio and TV to the internet, right?
Huge portfolio. And you know they've got some strong opinions about how the internet should be regulated, especially with all the debate about those social media giants.
Oh yeah, they definitely have thoughts on that. They see those companies as a major threat to free speech, don't they? Claiming they censor conservative viewpoints.
Exactly. And their big solution is to rein in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
Section 230, that's the one that basically protects those companies from lawsuits over what their users post, right?
That's the one. It's been called the bedrock of the internet, but they argue that it's been twisted and used to allow these platforms to silence dissenting voices. They want to see it either repealed or significantly reformed.
That would be a seismic shift with huge ripple effects across the internet. It's interesting how they frame this as a free speech issue, not just a debate about corporate power.
It's a smart strategy, connecting it to a core American value. And it's not just about what Americans are allowed to say online. They're also worried about foreign influence, especially from China.
So less about cat videos and more about national security.
Exactly. They want the FCC to crack down on Chinese tech companies like Huawei and TikTok.
Ban them outright.
They're not afraid to go there. Heavy restrictions, potential bans, the whole 9 yards. They argue these companies pose a serious threat to American interests.
It's fascinating how they connect these seemingly disparate issues, economic concerns, national security, even social issues like free speech.
Yeah.
It's all part of the same puzzle in their view.
Absolutely. And that interconnectedness is on full display when they talk about the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, the agency that oversees campaign finance.
I guess the referees of our elections. What do they have to say about how campaign finance is regulated?
They're not happy with the FEC as it currently stands. They call it partisan, ineffective, basically incapable of ensuring fair elections. Their solution: more transparency, more accountability, a much more aggressive approach to enforcing the existing campaign finance laws.
So less about rewriting the rules and more about making sure the current rules are actually being followed.
Exactly. They're especially concerned about loopholes that allow what they call dark money to influence elections, and they see the FEC as dropping the ball on that.
It's a pattern we've seen throughout this entire deep dive. It's not always about creating new laws or new agencies. It's about using the existing ones more forcefully, more strategically.
You got it. They're not afraid to use government power to achieve their goals, but they often frame it as restoring balance, right? Reining in agencies that they believe have strayed too far from their original purpose.
Which brings us to another agency they'd love to put on a shorter leash, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC.
The FTC is like the poster child for what they see as mission creep.
Mm.
It was originally created to focus on antitrust, preventing monopolies, but they argue that it's expanded into all these other areas like consumer protection and privacy regulation that they believe should be handled by other agencies, or even better, the private sector.
So less about protecting consumers from bad actors and more about letting businesses fight it out in the free market. Is that their thinking?
Exactly. Their view is that a truly free market is the best form of consumer protection because businesses will have to compete for customers. They'll have to offer better products and services or they'll get left behind.
Survival of the fittest.
That's the idea.
It's very consistent with their overall philosophy, that's for sure. And it leads to some pretty radical proposals for reshaping these agencies. But they're not done yet, are they? We've still got all those other agencies, the ones that don't always grab the headlines but still wield a lot of power.
You're talking about agencies like the Small Business Administration, the SBA, the Export-Import Bank, XMM, even back to a familiar target, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. They've got a bone to pick with all of them.
Starting with the SBA, you'd think they'd be all for it. After all, it's about helping small businesses, and they love to talk about small businesses as the backbone of the economy.
Oh, they're all for helping small businesses, in theory. But they're really critical of how the SBA actually operates. Too bloated, too inefficient, that's their take. They argue it often picks winners and losers based on political connections rather than actual merit.
So reform, not necessarily abolish.
Right. They want to see a leaner, more effective SBA, one that operates more like a well-run business with clear metrics for success and a real focus on accountability.
There's that business-minded approach to government again. What about XVAM, the Export-Import Bank? That one's all about helping American companies sell their goods overseas, right?
XM is interesting because it really highlights a division within conservative circles. Some absolutely love it, arguing it's absolutely essential for helping American businesses compete globally, especially against foreign companies that receive government subsidies.
It's about leveling the playing field.
Exactly. But other conservatives, they can't stand XM. They call it corporate welfare, plain and simple. They argue that it mainly benefits large companies that don't actually need the help.
So it's that classic debate. When does government support for business cross the line and become an unfair handout?
It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers. But it gets to the heart of a much bigger argument about the role of government in a free market economy.
And what that role should be. But there's one agency where they don't seem to have any internal debate at all. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB.
Ah, yes, back for more punishment.
Their favorite punching bag. So what do they have planned for the agency in charge of protecting consumers from financial predators?
They want to see it gutted, if not completely abolished. Plain and simple. They argue it's become this unaccountable bureaucratic monster that just stifles innovation and punishes businesses with overly burdensome regulations.
It all ties back to their broader goal of shrinking the regulatory state, especially in areas they believe the free market can handle better.
Absolutely. And like it or not, this vision, if enacted, would have a huge impact on the American economy and the lives of everyday Americans.
So we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? We've gone from the inner workings of the bureaucracy to the global stage, all through the lens of this conservative playbook. It's a bold vision, ambitious, some might even say radical. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the big takeaway here is that we're at a potential turning point for American governance. Whether or not a conservative president actually takes office in 2025, these ideas, they're out there. They're shaping the conversation, influencing policy on both sides of the aisle, understanding these proposals, the logic behind them, the potential consequences. It's essential for anyone who cares about the future of this country.
It's bigger than just left versus right, Democrat versus Republican.
Absolutely.
It's about grappling with fundamental questions about the role of government, the limits of its power, what it means to have an American democracy in the 21st century.
Those are questions we all have a stake in answering.
And as always, we encourage you to keep digging, to challenge your own assumptions, to form your own conclusions. But hopefully this deep dive has given you a solid foundation for understanding this particular vision of America's future, a vision that's driven by a belief in limited government, individual responsibility, and a free market that can solve, well, almost everything.
It's a powerful vision.
It certainly is, and one that's sure to be hotly debated for years to come. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.